A funeral procession. The type of event everyone dreads yet inevitably faces. A somber journey walking behind a hearse, silent prayers on trembling lips, the air thick with grief. A final goodbye to a loved one. No words, just a heaviness that weighs on your chest. It's an emotional ritual, one that everyone knows, whether or not they've experienced it firsthand. But for one family, what should have been a moment of closure became a scene of unspeakable horror. Imagine this. The mourners are gathered, heads bowed, when out of nowhere, gunshots. The air cracks, breaking through the mournful silence. People scatter, hearts racing. And in that moment, a woman's life is torn away, right in front of her grieving family. This is not a fictional tale, this is a true story. One that unfolds in the shadow of an innocent farewell. A woman whose only intent was to mourn the loss of her brother becomes the victim of a senseless act. The mourner's cries are drowned out by the sound of violence, and what should have been a time for reflection became a moment of terror. The question lingers. What happened? What could drive someone to turn a peaceful procession into an act of rage? Was it personal, or was there something deeper, some unseen force at play? There are so many unanswered questions surrounding this incident. Questions that go beyond the act itself, questioning everything from the people involved to the motives behind such violence. And the most chilling part? The investigation doesn't offer any easy answers. No one saw it coming, and even now the puzzle pieces don't seem to fit together. What drives a person to commit such a horrific act during such a vulnerable moment? Was it an act of vengeance, a calculated plan, or a momentary lapse of sanity? This isn't just another story of a crime gone wrong. This is a story that digs deep into the core of human emotions, the complexity of grief, the depth of secrets, and how easily an otherwise tranquil moment can be shattered. A funeral, of all things, where we expect calm and closure, became the backdrop for a tragedy that left a family shattered and a community in disbelief. If you're sitting on the edge of your seat, waiting to find out what could possibly have led to such a tragedy, then stick with us. We're about to explore the intricate layers of this case, peeling back the surface and uncovering the chilling details of what transpired that day. It's a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature and how sometimes the darkest moments emerge from the most unexpected places. So, what do we know? The victim, a woman in her 30s, was shot during her brother's funeral procession, an event that should have been full of mourning but instead became a nightmare. But this is just the beginning. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened that day. If you're captivated by unraveling true crime stories and want to hear more about real-life mysteries like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means a lot, and it helps us bring more of these incredible and often chilling stories to light. Now let's take a deeper look at the events leading up to that fateful day. Stay with us. What you're about to hear is a twist you won't see coming. Before we dive into the shocking events that unfolded, let's take a moment to understand the lives of those affected by this tragedy. This wasn't just another random act of violence. This was a family and a community grieving the loss of a loved one. The brother who had passed, the one they were there to bury, was known by many as a man who was full of life. He wasn't a saint by any means, but he had a good heart. His name was Marcus Turner. Friends remembered him as someone who always had a smile on his face, even in the hardest of times. He'd been a fixture in the local community, a man who had a history, both good and bad, but always seemed to make his way back to the people who mattered most. Marcus had been struggling with health issues for some time, battling a long illness. The cause of his death wasn't immediately clear, but some close to the family suspected his deteriorating condition had played a role. Still, no one could have predicted that the day they would say goodbye to him would turn into something much darker than anyone could have imagined. His sister, the woman who would become the tragic victim of this story, was Romesha Turner. She was Marcus's only sister, and the bond between them was undeniable. She had been his rock during his illness, tirelessly caring for him as his condition worsened. Friends and family described her as fiercely protective, someone who could always be counted on no matter what. Romesha was 34 years old at the time, a single mother with a strong sense of family loyalty. She wasn't just attending the funeral as a sibling, she was there to say her final goodbye to the man who had been her closest companion through thick and thin. Romesha had her own struggles like everyone else, but her devotion to her family, particularly to Marcus, stood as a testament to her character. She wasn't one for drama or unnecessary attention. She just wanted to honor her brother, give him a dignified farewell, and be there for the people she loved. The day of Marcus's funeral was eerily calm. It was a quiet afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a muted golden light over the small town. The temperature was mild, but there was a chill in the air, a reflection of the sadness that hung over the crowd. Romsha and the other mourners gathered at the funeral home. Family, friends, and acquaintances filled the room with soft whispers and sorrowful glances. The heavy silence spoke volumes. There was no need for words when everyone felt the weight of the loss. As the service concluded, Marcus's body was placed in the hearse and the procession began. It was a short drive from the funeral home to the cemetery, but every step of the journey felt like a lifetime. The funeral procession moved slowly. The hearse at the front, followed by a long line of cars, each one carrying family and friends who had come to pay their respects. Romesha, sitting in the back seat of a car behind the hearse, was lost in thought. Her eyes were fixed ahead, not focused on any particular thing. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly as they made their way through the neighborhood. The sounds of muffled voices and soft sobbing from the other cars faded in and out, and all that remained was the rhythmic hum of tires on the pavement. It should have been a peaceful moment of reflection, a time to honor Marcus and allow the family to grieve in peace. But in a place that should have felt safe, something didn't seem right. There were strange signs, tiny details that would only become significant later. The procession was taking a different route than usual. It wasn't the usual way they took to the cemetery, but perhaps no one questioned it. The streets were quieter than expected for a day like this, with very few pedestrians or cars in sight. And there were cars, unusual cars, trailing the procession. At first, no one thought much of it. People assumed they were just others on their way. But as the procession continued, the unease began to settle in. Some of the mourners felt it, an inexplicable tension in the air, like something wasn't quite right. For Romsha, the grief of the day was overwhelming. She was consumed by the sorrow of losing her brother. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her instincts were always sharp, and she couldn't ignore the strange cars tailing them. As the procession moved closer to its destination, a wave of unease swept over the group, even though no one spoke it aloud. The atmosphere became heavier, suffocating. No one could have predicted that what seemed like a quiet day of mourning was about to erupt into chaos. Just as the procession approached the cemetery, the feeling of unease reached its peak. A car sped past the procession at high speed, and for a moment Romsha caught sight of someone in the front seat, someone whose face she couldn't recognize. That was all it took. There was a split second of tension, a pause in time where every mourner felt it. And then, without warning, the unthinkable happened. The sound of gunfire shattered the stillness. Chaos erupted. The procession was coming to its final stretch, a stretch that was supposed to be quiet and somber, nothing more than a sad, reflective journey to say goodbye. The mourners were not expecting what happened next. Romesha's heart was heavy as she watched the hearse slowly approach the cemetery gates, the final resting place of her brother. It felt like time had slowed down, but she was consumed by grief, her mind a blur of emotions. Then, suddenly, the stillness was shattered. A car, speeding from behind the procession, swerved dangerously past the mourners and stopped a few feet ahead. The mourners' cars slowed to a crawl, confused, unsure of what was happening. Before anyone could react, a figure emerged from the car. Sharp, quick movements. The unmistakable sound of a gunshot rang through the air, breaking the tension like glass. The first shot, then another and another. In the span of seconds, Romsha's life was irrevocably altered. The screams from the other mourners rang out in the air as confusion gripped them. Romesha's own body jerked instinctively. Her head turned toward the sudden sounds, her heart racing as the world around her blurred into chaos. Gunshots continued, sharp, cutting through the fog of her mind. There were 4 shots in total, fast and precise, each one louder than the last. Romsha, trying to make sense of what was happening, didn't immediately realize the source of the shots was coming from the figure who had appeared from the speeding car. The first shot hit her brother's close friend, who was seated beside Romsha in another vehicle, and the impact sent him sprawling forward, his face contorted in agony. The second shot followed quickly, striking another mourner, a distant cousin who had traveled from out of town to attend the funeral. They fell to the ground instantly, their screams blending with the rapid-fire shots that followed. But it wasn't until the third shot that Romsha felt the searing pain. It wasn't until the searing sting of the bullet entering her own body that the full horror of the situation set in. Romsha gasped for breath, her body going limp as her hand instinctively went to her side. It was clear that she had been struck. The last shot came as a cruel punctuation mark on the madness. It struck the air, a final warning shot that left the shooter's intentions clear. This was no random act. The victim was someone they had targeted. As Romesha crumpled in her seat, the chaos around her escalated. The gunfire had sent everyone into a panic. People scrambled to get out of their cars, some ducking for cover, others screaming in terror, unsure whether more shots would come. There were no clear directions, just a frenzy of emotion, confusion, and survival instincts kicking in. The scene erupted into absolute chaos. The initial shock rendered everyone frozen, unsure of what to do, each person in the procession fighting their own instincts. Romesha's car door was quickly flung open by a relative who scrambled to pull her out of the vehicle, desperate to get her to safety. Blood dripped from her body, staining the asphalt beneath her as they moved her toward the safety of a nearby parking lot. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide with disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. People were yelling, crying, calling out for help, but no one knew what to do. Some mourners ran for cover, others knelt down beside the injured, trying to apply pressure to the wounds and keep the victims from succumbing to their injuries. A few of the bystanders had already dialed emergency services. Within minutes, though it felt like an eternity, sirens pierced the air. The sound of police and paramedics rushing to the scene created an eerie soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. The authorities arrived with flashing lights, their vehicles creating a chaotic blur in the parking lot. Officers immediately began to assess the situation, securing the area and trying to control the crowd. Paramedics swarmed the scene, attending to the wounded, with one paramedic kneeling beside Romsha, his hands working swiftly to stabilize her. Despite the immediate attempts to save her, it was clear from the way her body slumped that she was not out of danger yet. The shooting was quick, but its aftermath was drawn out. The family, the community, and even the investigators would spend days, weeks, and even months trying to piece together what had happened in those few harrowing minutes. A sense of disbelief and shock overtook the scene. How could this have happened at a funeral? How could something so violent, so senseless, interrupt what was supposed to be a time for remembrance and closure? In the midst of the chaos, the emotional impact on the family was immediate and all-encompassing. Romesha's relatives and friends were beside themselves. A family member, Marcus's cousin, described the moment in raw terms, recalling, "I couldn't even process it. I saw Romesha fall and I knew she was hit, but my mind just wouldn't believe it. We came here to bury Marcus, and now we're fighting to keep his sister alive." Family members, friends, and witnesses all struggled to comprehend the violence they had just witnessed. The grief of losing Marcus was still raw, yet now they were faced with a new, overwhelming tragedy. Romesha's life was in jeopardy. Her children, who had been in attendance, had seen everything. They watched as their mother, someone they had always known to be strong, unwavering, fell before their eyes. Their tears and fear were the heart-wrenching reality of the devastation that was still unfolding. A close friend of Romsha who had been by her side throughout the service was the first to make the call to the family, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what had happened. "It's Romsha. They shot her. They shot her at the funeral. I don't know what's going on." The questions unanswered lingered in the air. Why was Romsha targeted? Why would someone use the act of a funeral procession as an opportunity for violence? Was this a case of mistaken identity, or was there a deeper, more personal vendetta at play? The pain of losing Marcus was compounded by the fear of losing Romesha, who had been an anchor to this family, a sister, a mother, and a friend. The survivors were left grappling with both the immediate shock and the deep emotional toll of witnessing such a senseless act of violence during what was meant to be a peaceful farewell. The shooting had torn through the heart of the funeral procession like a jagged wound, and now, the aftermath was a scene of chaos and confusion. The police arrived swiftly, but their presence did little to calm the panic that had overtaken the mourners. As officers swarmed the area, their primary goal was securing the perimeter. They quickly ushered witnesses behind barricades and worked to keep the scene clear of anyone who might interfere with their investigation. The officers worked methodically, their faces hardening as they realized just how calculated the attack had been. They immediately began collecting any evidence that might shed light on the shooter's identity. First, the crime scene itself, shell casings scattered on the ground, the smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air, like an unspoken reminder of the violence that had just transpired. Each shell casing was carefully collected and placed into evidence bags, catalogued and transported for analysis. It was standard procedure, but the detectives knew this case was anything but routine. This wasn't a random shooting in the heat of the moment. There was something deliberate about this act, something personal. Witnesses were questioned immediately. Some were too rattled to provide coherent statements, their voices trembling, barely able to recount the details. Others were more composed but had little to offer beyond vague descriptions of the shooter's car, the speed at which it had come and gone, and the figure who had exited with alarming speed. A few mourners had been able to spot the license plate number of the car, but the plate had been a stolen one, a dead end that led nowhere. The detectives turned their attention to nearby businesses, checking if any security cameras had caught a glimpse of the shooter or the vehicle that had sped off. Hours passed as they pored over footage, trying to piece together the puzzle. A convenience store just a few blocks away had captured a partial view of the car, but the footage was grainy, making it difficult to make out details. It was a start, but it didn't reveal the key piece of information they needed: the identity of the shooter. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the crime scene, the investigators took stock of what they had. The evidence was sparse, and the emotional fog that surrounded the case made it all the more difficult to think clearly. How could someone do something like this at a funeral? As the investigation took shape, the police began to entertain several theories. The most obvious question they faced was why this family had been targeted. In a tragedy like this, the motive could have been anything: a personal vendetta, a case of mistaken identity, or even gang-related violence, but which one? The theory that quickly surfaced was a personal vendetta. Marcus, the brother who had passed, had always been known for being a no-nonsense kind of guy. He had made enemies in his life, particularly due to his involvement in some business ventures that had raised a few eyebrows. The police began looking into Marcus's past, hoping to uncover any hints of a long-standing grudge or an individual who might have harbored a desire for revenge. They dug into his old acquaintances, some of whom had already been interviewed during the early stages of the investigation. But as they did, they were struck by an unsettling possibility. Could it be that Marcus wasn't the intended target at all? Could the gunfire have been meant for someone else in the family? Maybe Romsha herself, who had always been at the center of the family dynamics, a strong-willed, outspoken figure who had a way of making both friends and enemies. There was a brief moment of silence when the detectives considered this. Romsha had no known enemies, but the more they thought about it, the more they wondered if the killer had mistaken her for someone else. Another theory began to take shape, one that seemed increasingly plausible: mistaken identity. The shooter's chaotic behavior and the rapid shots taken seemed almost frenzied, as if the individual hadn't fully thought things through. Perhaps they had been targeting someone in the procession but had made a terrible error. As the detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover another angle, one that suggested the possibility of gang-related activity. The area had been known for occasional violent outbreaks, especially between rival groups vying for control. But there was little concrete evidence that Marcus had been involved in any gang activity. Still, it was a line of inquiry the police couldn't ignore. They turned their attention to any unusual activity in the area prior to the shooting, questioning local residents and checking surveillance footage from nearby street cameras. But while there were murmurs about drug deals and altercations in the neighborhood, nothing concrete pointed directly to the funeral as the intended target of a gang-related dispute. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions seemed to multiply. The more they learned about Marcus's connections, his friends, his enemies, the more the line between the victim and the intended target blurred. Was this a hit meant for Marcus? Was it meant for someone else? Or was there another, more chilling explanation entirely? By the time the detectives wrapped up their initial investigation, a few things were clear. The case wasn't as simple as it had first appeared. While they had gathered evidence, there were more questions than answers. For every lead they followed, new ones seemed to open up, and each lead revealed a deeper level of mystery, one that felt as though it could go on forever. But still, the biggest question remained. Who could have done this, and why would they target a grieving family in the first place? Theories swirled around the police as they pieced together fragments of witness accounts, forensic reports, and the shaky footage from the nearby store, but nothing seemed to lead to a definitive answer. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and with every passing hour, the emotional weight of the investigation grew heavier. Romesha's family, still in shock from the violent attack, could only stand by as the investigation unfolded. They wanted answers, but every new theory seemed to raise more doubt. Was the person they were grieving the true target, or was this a case of violence gone terribly wrong? The deeper the investigation went, the darker the possibilities became. Whoever was behind this attack had carefully chosen their time, their target, and their weapon. But why? What drove someone to act with such chilling precision? As the days passed, the police found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of clues, each one leading them further down a path they hadn't expected. And as the case grew colder, the pressure to find answers mounted. Would they be able to uncover the truth? Or would the haunting questions of the shooting remain unanswered, forever lost to the shadows? The days following the shooting were filled with a heavy sense of disbelief and sorrow. But what began as private grief soon exploded into a collective outcry. The local community, shaken to its core, responded with a fierce determination to find justice. Within hours of the tragedy, candles were lit and flowers were laid along the streets where the procession had ended in violence. Vigils were held in quiet spaces, and social media platforms buzzed with anger and calls for justice. It wasn't just the family that mourned, the entire neighborhood was grieving. Tears streamed down the faces of those who had witnessed the horror, their hearts aching for the family they had known for years. The town, once seemingly untouched by such brutality, now became a stage for grief-stricken rallies, marches, and peaceful protests. Signs declaring "Justice for Romesha" and "End Violence Now" were carried with unwavering resolve through the streets. Residents spoke openly about the systemic issues that had long plagued the area, issues of gang violence, economic disparity, and a justice system they felt was failing them. For many, the shooting wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest in a string of senseless acts that had become far too common. Romesha's murder became a symbol of a community that felt abandoned and unheard, calling out for change that seemed long overdue. As news of the funeral procession shooting spread, even those living outside the immediate area joined the movement for justice. Hashtags like #JusticeForRomesha trended for days, creating a digital platform where citizens from all walks of life expressed their outrage and demanded accountability. The community's reaction wasn't just anger, it was a force to be reckoned with, a collective grief that transcended race, age, and socio-economic status. Every message posted, every rally organized was a testament to the unity found in mourning and the urgent need for reform. Through all of this, Romesha's family remained at the forefront, their voices breaking through the noise of the community's sorrow. They refused to be silenced by grief or fear. Their pleas for justice were unwavering, their words sharp and emotional. In poignant interviews, Romesha's parents spoke of their heartbreak, their inability to comprehend how a day meant to honor their son had turned into a nightmare. How can anyone take a life so carelessly? My daughter deserves to know who did this. Romesha's father said in a trembling voice, his eyes filled with tears. We deserve answers. Romesha herself, visibly distraught but composed, addressed the media at one of the many rallies held in her brother's honor. We won't let this fade into nothing. Justice will come, and whoever did this will have to face the consequences. Their words struck a chord with everyone who heard them, as they painted a raw, heart-wrenching picture of a family robbed of not only their loved one but their peace of mind. The community listened, echoed their cries, and demanded that those responsible be brought to justice. The tragedy of the shooting didn't just tear apart a family, it touched the very soul of a community, weaving together the universal threads of loss, grief, and the yearning for justice. It became a story of resilience, a reminder that when faced with darkness, people come together to shine a light. The emotional toll of the investigation, the uncertainty that loomed, was a weight on everyone's shoulders. Yet, in that collective pain, there was a deeper understanding of what it meant to seek justice, not just for Romesha's family, but for all those who had lost loved ones to senseless violence. The community knew that the road ahead would be long, and though the investigation might stumble, their determination would not falter. Justice was more than a goal. It was a necessity, a promise they vowed to hold fast to. In the face of tragedy, people had found solidarity, bonded by empathy and the unwavering desire to hold accountable those who dared to disrupt a family's right to mourn. As the weeks turned into months, the search for answers continued. Yet the resolution of this case remained elusive. The family's hope was slowly wearing thin as the trail grew colder and fewer clues surfaced. Despite the outpouring of community support, and with the local media keeping the story in the public eye, there was still no breakthrough in the investigation. At first, the police were quick to suggest potential leads. They questioned several individuals seen in the area near the time of the shooting, but each lead turned out to be a dead end. Surveillance footage captured grainy images of a dark-colored sedan driving away from the scene, but the vehicle's make and model were too ambiguous to lead to any concrete suspects. Eyewitnesses recounted hearing several shots fired, but saw little more than flashes in the chaos. There were even whispers of a possible mistaken identity. Could Romesha have been caught in a crossfire meant for someone else? But nothing could be confirmed. For months, the community rallied for justice, pushing local authorities to prioritize the case, but still, no arrests were made. The family, desperate for closure, held out hope. Rumors circulated about possible gang involvement, about disputes from the past that may have resurfaced, but no direct connections were drawn between the victim and any of the suspects. In the absence of tangible leads, the investigation seemed to be slowly fading into the shadows, much to the horror of those who had once been so certain of a resolution. But then, several months after the incident, a breakthrough came, not from a new piece of physical evidence but from a phone call. An anonymous tipster provided a detailed account of a suspect who had been seen acting suspiciously near the scene on the day of the funeral. The police, now with new momentum, re-examined old evidence, revisited witness statements, and began to piece together a theory that started to make sense. Could this tip be the key to solving the case? As of today, the investigation is ongoing. There are still no formal arrests, and no one has been officially charged in connection to the death of Romesha's brother or the shooting of Romesha herself. But the community continues to demand answers, their grief turning into a fierce call for justice. The case is not closed. There are still too many questions, too many unknowns. So here we are, still wondering, what really happened that fateful day? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was it a random act of violence, a senseless loss? Or was there something deeper behind it? A personal vendetta or a retaliation? Could the mourners have seen the danger coming? And if so, why was it allowed to escalate so quickly? One thing remains certain. The impact of this tragedy is far from over. The loss that Romesha's family has endured will ripple through generations, and the unresolved questions continue to haunt the town, lingering in the minds of all who have followed the story. As we close today's chapter on this heartbreaking case, we leave with more questions than answers. But the fight for justice, for closure, and for truth is far from over. The community refuses to let this tragedy fade into obscurity. For them, for Romesha, and for her brother, the search for justice will continue. What do you think happened that day? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this video. Your support helps keep these stories alive and reminds us all of the power of justice, even in the darkest of times. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.